Hello everyone, welcome to session 9 of LTEC 654, Programming Games and Simulations. I want to begin by looking at the feedback from the session 8 survey. Now, of course, the first part of the survey focused on the Godot tutorials. And we had 13 people respond. And as you can see here, around 70% of folks said that in terms of pacing, the Godot tutorials are just right. And we had about 30% say they're a little bit too fast. Now, when we asked about how you would rate the length of the Godot tutorials, the majority of you, nearly 85%, said that the length of the tutorials was just right. Now, when I asked about how you would rate the difficulty of the Godot tutorials, here we see a bit of a spread. 62% of you said 8 people said the tutorials difficulty was just right. 3 people said they were a little too hard. And then we had one person say they're altogether too hard. And then we had another person say they're a little too easy. The next part of the survey asked about the programming assignments. Now, here we see a bit more variation. One of the questions was, how would you rate the amount of time you spend on programming assignments? 6 people, or 46% of you, said a little too much time is spent on these assignments. Another 30%, or 4 people, said just altogether too much time, and 3 people said it was just right. And then in terms of difficulty, 38% said that the difficulty of the programming assignments was just right. We have another 5 people who said that the assignments are a little too hard. And then we had 3 people say that they are outright just too hard. Finally, the last section of the survey asked about feedback on programming in Godot. And one of the questions was to agree or disagree with the statement, I feel like I'm learning how to use Godot. And fortunately, 11 of you agreed or strongly agreed that you're learning how to use Godot. I think that's excellent. If you recall back to the second week of the class, we looked at that the vast majority, I think everyone in the class strongly disagreed that they knew anything about Godot. So we're definitely seeing some progress here. Now, the next question asked if you understand the programming concepts we've learned about so far. And here we're seeing a bit of a split. We have about 8 people agreeing and strongly agreeing. And then we have 5 people that are kind of on the fence. They feel somewhat neutral. Now, the next question asked whether or not you feel you can implement the programming concepts we've learned so far. And here we see a little bit of a shift towards the neutral to disagree. Now, if you're someone who feels like you disagree with being able to implement the programming concepts we've learned so far, please reach out to me so that I can give you the additional support you need to move you back into the neutral, agree, and strongly agree categories. And for those folks who are in the neutral category, please let me know how I can better support you. What are the areas that you feel you cannot implement? And then finally, the last one, here we see a big spread on I could build a simple game or simulation in Godot without assistance. And we see actually 7 people disagreeing or strongly disagreeing. And then we have 3 people agreeing or strongly agreeing, and we have 3 in the middle. Now, I kind of wished I had asked how you feel about if you could build a simple game or simulation in Godot with assistance. I'd be curious to see how this chart would change. Of course, there were some open-ended questions, and in particular, the survey asked, is there anything else you would like to share about programming in Godot? And some folks left some positive feedback, such as programming is fun now that I'm getting it. Another person wrote, I was nervous that they would be easy since we did a few on similar concepts. I think this is referring to the programming assignments. But I found enough in each one to challenge me and new concepts to work on. And another person wrote, I really like that a clear progression is forming between the recent programming assignments. They focus on essential skills while adding on 1 or 2 new ideas at a time. And of course, that is the design, but whether or not folks are seeing that clear progression depends a little bit on how comfortable they are with some of the earlier skills. Now, there were suggestions or areas of need, and one person wrote, what makes me discouraged sometimes is that I just feel like I'm picking it up in small pieces with repetition, but big concepts escape me. Another person wrote, it takes me a long time to figure out the first few steps. And another recommendation was some assignments would be more effective with longer due dates. Give us 2 weeks to complete it instead of 1. So thank you for all the valuable feedback. I think the biggest concern about the programming assignments is there was a little bit of a disconnect, and I can see that, between what is being taught in the tutorials and what is required in the programming assignments. It's not a one-to-one correspondence. I'm really asking you to transfer your thinking of what you've learned in the tutorials and testing to see if you can apply it. And I recognize now that we've gone through this that some of the programming assignments were simply a bit too far in terms of transferring those skills. So nearly everyone commented on that. So that's good, valuable feedback for me and will be helpful as we move forward and for future versions of this class. So thank you for the frank feedback. Now, I know many of you are interested in learning more about Godot, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about Godot resources. I want to talk about these resources because I think it's important to emphasize that there's no reason to memorize Godot script or to memorize all of the different concepts that we've been doing. It's very natural for programmers to look at old code, to look at code snippets on their computers, and even to Google things. In fact, programmers are known for looking up things all the time rather than memorizing it. So I want to point out a couple of resources that I think will be helpful. One of the things that I want to point everyone to is the Godot community's question and answer section. Now, you can see the URL here, godotengine.org/QA for question and answer. What's nice about this is you can search on any particular topic or question that you are interested in searching on. So you might be, how do I change the color of a label's text, for example? And doing a search on that will produce lots of results. Another thing you might want to pay attention to is going to the questions section. In fact, I like this quite a bit. And once you click on questions, this is what you see. And if you look here at this bar, you can sort these questions in different ways. So I happen to have selected here the most viewed questions. So you can see here, the most viewed question is, how would I go about picking a random number? And you can see that this has 20 plus votes and it has 3 different answers. So if I was actually to go inside of that, what you would see is someone asked the question, how would I go about picking a random number in Godot? And then somebody has actually written an answer showing the code for how to generate random numbers. If the answer is green, like the one shown here, that means that the community agrees that it is more or less the best answer. Now, another really important resource for those of you who are wanting to learn more about the power of Godot is Godot's official documentation. And importantly, this documentation really breaks down into 3 sections. There's a getting started section, there are specific tutorials that you can use, and then there's something called the class reference. So let me talk a little bit about these different sections of the official documentation. The first thing I want you to look at is in the Getting Started section, and it is the section focused on scripting. And it is all about using Godot script. And in particular, I want to highlight the section called GDScript Basics. There's an introduction, it talks about the language, it talks about some of the built-in types and how it handles data. This is excellent reading. I recommended it as an optional reading earlier in the semester. Now that most of you have a little bit more confidence and a bit more understanding, it would be a good idea to come back to this and reread the Godot script basics, because a lot of it is going to make a lot more sense to you now that you have some experience with the language. Another important section of this is GDScript, an introduction to dynamic languages. For those of you who know some other programming languages, which may be static or dynamic, this is a very nice introduction to what makes Godot script dynamic and how it's different from other kinds of languages. And then finally, I'd like to point out the Godot script style guide. And these are the conventions that we should all be following in order to write good, clean, easy to read code in GDScript. The last part that I want to point out is what they call the class reference. Now, the class reference is literally, you could think of it as kind of like the Bible or the encyclopedia of a programming language. And so here you're seeing a list of all of the nodes and classes that come built into Godot. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. You can see here just in this list, we're just dealing with the A's. Now, some of them you will begin to recognize. So for example, we have this semester begun to learn a little bit about animated sprite. So if I was to click on that, I would see what we call the documentation for the class named animated sprite. And we can see here, there's a short description. An animated sprite is a sprite node that can use multiple textures for animation. And then there's a bit more information in the description. Now, also, if we look up here, we can see that this section of the class reference dedicated to animated sprite has a description, properties, methods, signals, so on and so forth. And I can focus in on some of these important areas. So one of the questions that came up in the feedback survey was, well, what if we want to learn more about the nodes that we've been using? Or what if we want to learn more about some of the code hints that we've been seeing in Godot? Well, this is the place where you could do that. Now, this takes a little bit of practice to read, but let's take a look at some of the properties. You can see here, these are properties shown in the middle column of the animated sprite class. So one of the properties is the animated sprite centered? That's the second row. Its default value is true, but we could also set it to false. Another one that you would recognize is the second from the bottom, which is the property playing. In our code, we have said $animated sprite.playing equals true, and that makes the animated sprite play. The reason I'm pointing this out to you, of course, is that I want you to know what all of the properties related to animated sprites are and where you can find that information. And the same is true for the methods. How do you make an animated sprite play? Well, there's a method called play, and there's a method called stop. Now, another handy feature of the class reference is actually being able to search. So, for example, I've typed in the keyword timer, and the search results come up, and I can click on all of the search results, and it lists a whole bunch of them. But what I want to do is read about the timer class. So if I click on that, it takes me here. It says, what is a timer? A timer is just simply a countdown timer. In the description, it says, counts down a specified interval and emits a signal on reaching 0. Can be set to repeat or one-shot mode. And if I go a little bit further down, here are all of the properties of the timer class. So let's take a look at these. One of the properties is paused, and that is a Boolean, which means it can be either true or false. And how might we use that in code? Well, we might write something like this, $timer.paused equals true. Now, here's another example, one shot. Now, I don't really know what one shot means. So if I was to click on that, further down in the class reference, it would tell me that one shot. It says, if true, the timer will stop when reaching 0. If false, it will restart. So in other words, the one-shot property tells us whether or not our timer should just be a one-off or a one-shot timer, or whether or not we want it to count down once and stop or repeat. And we might do that with code by doing something like this. Timer.oneShot equals true, or we could set it like this, $timer.setOneShot to true, and pass the true value. And of course, we can do the same thing with the methods. Imagine we had looked at the isStop method, and what does that method do? Well, it just returns the value true if the timer is stopped. And so in our code, we might write something like this. If $timer is stopped equals true, then print game over. So this is just a little overview of some of the existing documentation that I know many of you are ready to start paying attention to. This documentation is difficult to read, and it actually takes some experience before you begin to look at and can make sense of the information. But ultimately, the point is that no programmer can understand all of the features, properties, and methods of all of the classes and nodes within the Godot engine. And so most programming languages come with some sort of documentation so that programmers can look things up. Now, I also want to emphasize emphasize that there are external third-party resources. So you might want to check out the tutorials at GD Quest. There's a nice Godot 3 tutorial series from Games from Scratch. And there's also some excellent tutorials at Kids Can Code related to Godot. So these are all extra resources, those of you who want to reinforce some of the basics, and for those of you who want to move faster can leverage to find out what you want to know about Godot. Now finally, I just want to take a couple of minutes to take a look at the calendar here. So you can see here we're actually beginning session 9 now. And as you will see later this week, I'm going to be introducing your game production project number 1. And that game production project number 1 is going to be due in session 12. In other words, we'll have about 4 weeks to work on that. Keeping in mind that next week, of course, is spring break. And then again in session 13, we'll have our second game production project, which will be due at the end of the semester in session 16. I'll be giving you much more details about your game production projects, but I just wanted to let you know where we're going in the second half of the semester. Okay, everyone, we're out of time for today. Have a great week, and I'll see you in Canvas.